I want to, we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the, I guess, best practices around avoidance of clinical holds. So I want to throw that one out there, given, the obvious desires to avoid some of the ramifications that we've just discussed around clinical holds. What are some best practices you can suggest for avoiding one? Daniela, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Matt. I do have 4 very specific recommendations for avoiding a clinical hold. I will start with something that Helen was mentioning earlier, which is make sure to select the right animal model. Non-clinical safety studies need to be adequate and sufficiently comprehensive to evaluate the risk of the investigational treatment in humans. So the selection of the right animal model is paramount. The second recommendation is to pay attention to the chemistry, manufacturing, and control section of your IND. For example, it is really critical to demonstrate that the drug product is controlled adequately and that the manufacturing process will not introduce impurities that may pose risk to patients. The FDA reviewers will look at this very carefully. Another recommendation I have is to document reasonable expectation of safety in the informed consent form. Now, while the agency does not routinely require a copy of the informed consent form as part of every IND, the agency may request one for certain high-risk study populations or certain therapeutic areas. To give you an example, pediatrics or oncology. So I find that having informed consent form ready at the time of IND submission is helpful. Final recommendation is to engage the right experts to understand all potential risks. Often, emerging biotech are not fully staffed with subject matter experts in all the disciplines that are required for a complete, robust, and successful IND. So engaging with outside experts can be valuable.
Thank you, Daniela. Helen, anything you'd add to Daniela's very, very thorough and orderly response?
Yeah, it was a great response. Totally agree with her recommendations. The only other recommendation that I would have is when you go in for a pre-IND and the FDA gives you specific feedback, a big mistake is to assume that you know better than they do and not take their feedback when you submit your IND. I usually recommend to folks, when you have your pre-IND and the FDA gives you the list of all their comments, instead of just submitting the pre-IND feedback as an attachment to your IND submission, actually lay out their concerns in a table and tell them where you've addressed their concerns in the IND so that they can quickly look at that. By avoiding their comments and assuming that what they said doesn't matter, that's going to really put you at risk for, a clinical hold if they had concerns regarding a CMC or non-clinical issue. So I always take the approach of, I have a tremendous amount of respect for the FDA. They have experts. They're trying to really work with you. So show them that you have heard them and that you take their guidance seriously.
It's interesting. We just, as you were speaking, Helen, we got a response in the Q&A box from Audrey saying that this is a great suggestion that you're making. And I listened to you say it, and these are words that I've heard on multiple occasions when talking with regulatory affairs professionals in bio. And it amazes me sometimes. Like it just seems so, like, I've never done it, obviously, but I'm sitting here thinking, like, who wouldn't? We have a thing in our industry and in the media, if you're a journalist, called a stet. A stet is where, like, you receive your editor's comments or proof, edits on a story you wrote, and if you disagree with that editor's comment or change suggestion, you stet it, you ignore it, and generally you have a conversation. You say, I'm stetting this, but we're gonna have a conversation about why. And then we have a thing called the silent stet, where you just stet it and don't go back to your editor and have a conversation. You just let it fly under the radar, and it gets published. And this is a big no-no. Like, the editors do not appreciate silent stets, and I would imagine that the FDA does not appreciate the equivalent in ignorance of commentary on an IND submission. And it boggles my mind that people in your position say, hey, don't do that, because it obviously implies that people do that.
I think it depends, on the situation. I think some people think we know our science better than you do, or industry. As a government agency, you might be a bit behind in terms of the technology. But, like, for example, when you submit a pre-IND, they have 30 days to thoroughly go through that document. And if they take the time to give you, sometimes I find the agency will give you responses to questions you didn't even ask. That is a gold mine. That is a plus. And when they do that, they're going out of their way to make sure that you have a successful IND. Their job is not to keep you at bay. Their job is to find and get innovative products into patients that are safe and have the potential to address an unmet medical need, whether it's for better efficacy or better safety. So, I have heard of people who decide not to address the agency's concerns. They either just repeat the same information back in the IND, or they don't give additional data, which they should. The agency is flexible as long as you have data to justify your request. Mm-hmm. They would be willing to, entertain it. But when they go out of their way to give you additional advice, it would be wise to accept it.